This is Derek Atkins, and this video lecture is for the Theology 2 course at the East Asia School of Theology. This video lecture is on the constitutional nature of human beings. One of the great theological and philosophical debates of the last 400 years is the mind-body debate. In its simplest form, the mind-body debate asks the question, what is the relationship between the mind and the body? Now, if this sounds like an esoteric debate that has nothing to do with the real world, nothing could be farther from the truth. A lot hangs on the mind-body debate because this debate is really asking whether we're only physical creatures who are made up of only atoms, chemicals, and neurons, or whether we're living spirits. If we're only physical creatures, as philosophical naturalists, materialists claim, then when we die, that's simply the end of the story. That's all, folks. But if we're living spirits, then this means that death is not the end of the story. Today's lesson does not get into the question of what happens to us after we die, but it does provide an important foundation for the whole question of what happens after we die. Now, in Christian theology, there are three basic views about the makeup of humans. There is the monist view, the dichotomous view, and the trichotomous view. And we will go through these views now. So, the first view that I'm going to talk about is the trichotomous view. According to the trichotomous view, human beings are divided into three basic parts: body, soul, and spirit. And so the biblical basis for the trichotomous view is 1 Thessalonians 5:23 and Hebrews 4:12. Now, let's look at some definitions that go into this view. The body is the material or physical part of human beings, our flesh, our bones and muscles and internal organs and so forth. The soul is the animal aspect which relates to other creatures and includes intellect, emotion, will, and self-consciousness. And then there is the spirit. This is the spiritual part that relates to God and enables us to be aware of God. So this is how trichotomists would define these three different parts of humans. Now, there is a problem, and that problem is linguistically and semantically. Soul and spirit are used interchangeably. And this is much like the words gift and present, which are also used almost interchangeably in everyday English. So if soul and spirit are used interchangeably, then how can you differentiate between them in the trichotomous view? Now, we have examples of this interchangeability in places in the Bible, such as Genesis 4:41-8. Also, you can look at Psalm 42:6, as well as Hebrews 12:23 and Revelation 6:9. Now, verses like 1 Thessalonians 5:23 are probably better understood as colloquial expressions like those found in Mark 12:30, where we are called on to love God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength. Because in Mark 12:30, the emphasis is on totality. That is, every aspect of our being. We are to love God with all that we are. It is not intended, therefore, this verse in Mark 12:30 is not intended to teach us about the constitutional nature of human beings. Now, by way of analogy, I might say something like, give it all you've got. What I don't mean is that you should give away everything you possess. What I do mean is that you should try your hardest to accomplish some goal or to achieve some feat. So that's the trichotomous view. The second view in Christian theology about the constitutional nature of humans is the dichotomous view. The dichotomous view says that human beings are divided into two basic parts, the material and the immaterial. And so dichotomists would claim do have verses that they point to support their view. This begins with Genesis 12:2-7, which affirms only two parts, dust and spirit. For, God, it speaks of how God made the first man, Adam, out of dust, and then he breathed into him the breath of life, and man became a living spirit. Okay. There's also Matthew 10:28, 1 Corinthians 5:3, and 3 John chapter 2. And so these other three biblical references mention body and soul, or body and spirit, that make up the person. And so the human soul or spirit is a spiritual, that is, immaterial entity. This is the part of the person that persists after death. Okay? So we see that definition here. The human soul or spirit is a spiritual or immaterial entity, and this is the part of a person that persists after death. So that's the dichotomous view. Then we have the monist view. And according to the monist view, humanity is made up of only one part, the material, matter, and energy that are arranged in various levels of complexity. Thus, we are like animals, but we can still relate to God. The higher capacities like self-awareness and self-determination are emergent properties which are inherent to the nature of matter when it becomes increasingly complex. And monists do argue that there is that they have biblical basis for their view. For example, animals in the Bible are spoken of as living souls. They also argue that monism is based on the concept of physical resurrection, as well as what has been called soul sleep. And this again gets into the question of what happens after we die, because there are some people who argue that our body goes into a soul sleep, and that we remain asleep in this soul sleep until the day of resurrection. And this soul sleep is based on the monist view, which is the view that our bodies and our souls are one and the same, that we are complete unity. Then there is the multifaceted view, which says there are many terms that are used in the Bible to describe humanity's material and immaterial nature. For example, in terms of our material nature, the Bible describes us as dust. We see this in Genesis 2:17 and 2:7, Genesis 2:7, and 1 Corinthians 15:47. The Hebrew word here is hapar, and this is what Adam is created from by God. Paul in the New Testament refers to this passage and uses the term earth, ga, and earthly, choikos, to describe it in contrast to the heavenly body that we will receive at the coming of Christ. Another word that the Bible uses to describe our bodies, our physical bodies, is flesh. And we find this in Leviticus 14:9, 2 Corinthians 4:11, and Hebrews 2:14. The Hebrew word is basar, and the Greek word is sarx. Paul uses this word in a negative spiritual sense, as well as in a more physical and literal sense. The writer of Hebrews refers to humans as those with flesh and blood, and notes that Jesus partook of the same. And this language is from the NASB translation. The Bible also refers to our physical body with the word body, and we find this in Matthew 10:28, 1 Corinthians 6:20, and Colossians 2:9. The Greek word that is used here is soma. The Colossian passage notes that Jesus was the physical embodiment of God. The Bible also refers to the body in terms of with the word members. And we find this in Romans 6:13. The Greek word used here is mele, and usually refers to specific parts of the physical body, that is, arms, legs, hands, etc. But these parts are referred to generally and not specifically. And then there are other terms that are used in the Bible to describe our physical bodies. In fact, there are numerous other more specific ways that the biblical writers referred to the physical aspects of human beings, but due to time and space constraints, we will not explore any of these here. And but we do see a variety of terms used to describe both the body and the soul or spirit. And this leads us to our immaterial nature. There are a number of words that the Bible uses to describe our immaterial or spiritual nature. The first of these is the word heart, which we find in Matthew chapter 15, 19, and 20, as well as Hebrews 4:17. The Greek word used here is cardia. This is where we get the word cardiology and cardiologist. Okay, this is obviously being used figuratively, and not referring to the actual organ that pumps blood in our body, but it refers to the immaterial center of feeling and emotion. Okay, so this is one of the words that the Bible uses to describe our soul or our immaterial selves. The Bible also uses the word conscience. This is found in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 7, 10, and 12. So the Bible talks of how we have a conscience. And so this conscience is also part of our soul or our spirit. And the Greek word used for conscience is synodesis. This refers to our moral sensibility, our understanding of what is right and what is wrong. The Bible also talks about the mind, and we find this in Romans 12:2. The Greek word for mind is nous, N-O-U-S. Again, this is not referring to the brain as an organ, but to the mind as the seat of understanding, as the place of understanding. The Bible also speaks of the will as being part of our spirit. This is found in Romans chapter 6, verses 12 and 13. The Greek word for will is thelema, and this refers to the center of our conscious decisions and choices. Now, let's talk about the relationship between our material and immaterial aspects. Millard Erickson uses the term conditional unity to describe the relationship between our material and our immaterial aspects. That is the relationship between our bodies and our souls. And so this is the term that Erickson coined, and this may be the best explanation of what we are getting at with respect to the relationship between both aspects of our human nature. We are created for embodiment, but our soul can be separated from our bodies and retain our identity in the process. Nevertheless, we are made for embodiment, and in the new heaven and earth, we will be fitted with bodies appropriate for that future existence. Now, Erickson explains this understanding or this truth so well. I will quote him at length on this idea. This is what Millard Erickson writes. The full range of biblical data can best be accommodated by the view that we will term conditional unity. According to this view, the normal state of a human is as an embodied unitary being. In Scripture, humans are not urged to flee or escape from the body as if it were somehow inherently evil. This monistic condition can, however, be broken down, and at death it is, so that the immaterial aspect lives on even as the material decomposes. At the resurrection, however, there will be a return to a bodily condition. The person will assume a body that has some point of continuity with the old body, but is also a new or reconstituted or spiritual body. Okay, so this explanation by Millard Erickson tries to explain all of the biblical data we see, because we see that we have bodies, and the Bible says that we have souls, and yet at death we know that our bodies die, and yet the Bible promises that there will be a resurrection, which implies that our bodies are somehow important. And so Millard Erickson's concept of conditional unity tries to make sense of all of the biblical data that we have about the relationship between the body and the soul. Now, let's go on to talk about the origin of the immaterial part of humanity. In other words, where does the human soul or spirit come from? Now, there are several theories among Christian theologians about where our soul comes from. The first of these is the Preexistent Theory. This is a Greek or Platonic view that the soul is immortal and pre-exists before it becomes embodied. It is an idea that lends itself to ideas of reincarnation and the transmigration of the soul. So that's the pre-existence theory. And there is a problem with the pre-existence theory, and that is it seems to remove our dependence upon God. Because if we already exist prior to being embodied, then how are we dependent upon God? How is our soul or spirit dependent upon God? So that is one problem with the pre-existence theory. There is also the creation theory, which says that God directly creates each person's soul at the moment of conception. So when the egg and the sperm unite, that is the moment that the human soul is created. Not only is the body created at that moment, but so is the human soul. And so this makes our souls a special creation of God. But the difficulty is that we have to address the issue of sin, and how is it that sin has infected our whole being if God creates our souls perfect and good? In other words, if our souls are created at the moment of conception, then how is it that we inherit this sin nature from our parents? Okay. That brings us to so this slide basically restates what I just said. The creation theory must address the problem of how sin enters the human race if God creates us, each one of us, as good at the moment of conception. And this brings us to the traducian theory. The traducian theory seems to do the most justice to the notion of soul and image in Adam's reproduction in Genesis 5:3. And what the traducian theory says is that the soulish aspect of humans is passed from generation to generation through conception and procreation. Okay. And as I said, this theory seems to do the most justice to the notion of soul and image in Adam's reproduction that we see in Genesis 5:3, where it talks about how he gave birth to a son who was like himself, and that son was Seth. Now, so as I said, the traducian theory seems to best account for the notion of soul and image in Adam's reproduction. So, we are created by God, body and soul, to image him in creation and to see that we are conformed to the image of Christ, body and soul. This is why Paul can say that our purchase of redemption includes our whole being, and we are therefore to glorify God in our bodies, which is what he says in 1 Corinthians 6:20, as well as in our spirits. So we will discuss this topic further in our class session.